I'm going to present my talk today on some of the challenges of conducting global vaccine studies. So the first question is, well, who are Synexus and what do we do? And I see we haven't got any slides for you to look at. Well, let me just explain to you whilst the slides are coming along. We are a company where we have 26 dedicated clinical research centres in 9 different countries. We recruit patients and healthy volunteers, and we conduct clinical studies on behalf of pharmaceutical companies, CROs, biotech, government organisations. We have our own doctors and nurses working full-time in these clinics. They only do clinical research. And we have all our own database of patients and healthy volunteers. We have all our own facilities. Our staff are fully trained in GCP. As you can see, we have quite a wide global footprint, and when it comes to vaccine trials, this gives us a great advantage in terms of being able to look at lots of different types of vaccine studies. So we have quite a range of different therapeutic vaccines that we've worked on, ranging from our clinics in South Africa and India to our clinics in Germany and the UK. We have a large database of healthy volunteers, wide differing age groups. We also have a very large database of patients as well, because we don't just do vaccine studies, we do studies in lots of different therapeutic areas. This is a snapshot of our vaccine experience in the last 2 years. And again, as you can see, there's quite some differences there. Some very interesting studies, particularly the traveller's diarrhea was an interesting trial, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Pediatric vaccine experience, I always look at this slide and think, it doesn't look like a lot there, but in fact, for anyone that's actually conducted pediatric studies, you'll know just how incredibly complicated they are and the enormous amount of work that they represent in terms of conducting the study and then actually getting regulatory approval for them. So what are some of the challenges of global vaccine studies? I think the first thing we have to do is to look at where the studies are being conducted. We tend to look at it in terms of the developed world and the developing world, because they are vastly different the way studies are done in these areas. And the first thing we need to look at is the type of vaccination study that's being done. Like I said before, we're going to be doing studies that are very varied depending upon whether it's India or Germany. We're going to have huge variations in the options of studies that we can do. And the need for the studies to be done as well is very different. Looking at what is the incentive for patients or volunteers to come into a clinical study with vaccines. The automatic assumption is, oh, but you're going to get protected from a disease, or you're going to be prevented from an illness of some kind. But is that always true? Remember, this is a study, so we might not even know how well it works. So what is the incentive for patients? And when you look at it, the incentive in the developing world can be very different from the developed world. Looking again at things like, what is the level of medical care that's already available? In some parts of the world, we have fabulous healthcare systems. That's going to play a part in how volunteers and patients will come into clinical studies versus places where there is no healthcare available. Education has a huge implication in terms of how we can recruit patients into clinical studies. And again, particularly for vaccine and particularly around pediatric studies. And I'm going to go into that in more detail later. Looking at the target population, I was thinking about this the other day. I can't remember the last time that I saw an influenza protocol that said they wanted healthy volunteers between 18 and 30. You know, when I look at the protocols now, they're very much focusing on cohorts. And this is because the regulators have turned around and said, we want to see data from the patients that are actually going, or the people who are actually going to be treated with these vaccines. We don't just want a certain cohort of age groups. So we're finding now that we're being requested to look for volunteers who are 60 to 70, 70 to 80, and the over 80s as well. So that's been a change that's been taking place over the last few years, and it's definitely been getting driven by the regulatory authorities. Looking at communication, this is really a very, very critical part to the success of a vaccine study, particularly when we're looking at the developing world. Many of the studies are going to be done in rural areas, and that's a big question. How do you keep communication going? How do you keep the follow-up with the subjects or the patients who have been involved in the study? That's a huge challenge. Multiple languages, new technology. Informed consent, and again, this is a huge problem in many of the developing countries. We automatically take it for granted here, rates of literacy. But where you have low literacy, how do you ensure that you're getting informed consent? ICH-GCP has very clear guidelines on this, and it's very important that we are able to demonstrate that anybody coming into a clinical study has got an understanding of what they're doing, why they're doing it. Again, it comes right back to the whole piece of why are patients coming into studies. The logistics. Being on the front line of clinical studies where we've physically got patients in front of us waiting to have their vaccine. I can honestly say that we've stood there and said, I'm sorry, the vaccine hasn't arrived yet. Again, depending upon where you are in the world, that can have a huge implication. If you're giving a vaccine for what's potentially a life-threatening condition, that's a huge blow for people who may have no other form of healthcare available to them. So one of my great pleas to anyone here who is involved in clinical studies is that the delivery of the vaccines, particularly to rural parts of the world in the developing nations, is so critically important. Reporting of SAEs, this is something that's very interesting, and I was reading some articles recently. The regulatory authorities are becoming very concerned at the underreporting of adverse events and serious adverse events in all clinical studies, not just in vaccines. And there is, I'm sure if we went around the room here, everyone could think of at least 2 or 3 drugs that have been taken off the market in the last couple of years through serious side effects that, had they been followed up or evaluated more closely at the clinical trial stage, they probably would never have gotten licensed, or if they had, there would have been significant warnings associated with them. So one of the things that's becoming very important in all clinical studies is to demonstrate that we're taking great care to ensure that we are actually evaluating adverse events and serious adverse events, and that we are making every effort possible that there's no underreporting of these events. Long-term follow-up. Again, with vaccine studies, there can be very short follow-up periods for vaccine studies, but there can also be quite long follow-up periods. And I'm going to go through a case history in a minute that will demonstrate that. There are some real challenges in terms of making sure that people are coming back to clinic, particularly when we're looking for things like immunogenicity, or if we're looking for complex endpoints as well. And again, it feeds into this whole idea of the adverse events. Working with multiple local stakeholders. Everybody here, I'm sure, is well aware of the red tape that's involved today in bringing clinical trials to fruition. Regulatory authorities, the ethics committees, but particularly with vaccine studies, and particularly with pediatric vaccine studies, there's a whole group of other stakeholders involved. And one of the things that's extremely important when you're planning a pediatric vaccine study is to take a step back and look at the countries where you're planning on doing this and ask the question, who are the local stakeholders going to be? Because those people are going to be very, very important to the success of your study. One of the things that we find extremely helpful in this scenario is talking to the principal investigator for the country where you're working. These will be the people that have done these studies many times, and they will know exactly who to speak to. And that's the key here, is actually working your way through the red tape, because you can get so bogged down and so delayed in it for so long. But if you know the right people to speak to, then you can actually get the process very smooth instead of stopping and starting and stopping and starting and stopping and starting. One of the things that we find talking with stakeholders is that many of them have had a very poor experience, particularly with commercial vaccine studies. And the same things come out over and over again, that they don't know what's happening, they're not kept up to date, timelines change, the studies protocol changes, they don't know what's happening. So a big issue here comes back to communication, making sure they're part of the communication plan, and when things change, ensuring that they're kept up to date. Because it's easy to forget that every one of these people has a boss to report into, and they have to give updates of what they're doing and how they're doing it and what's going on. But if they don't know, then that doesn't help them, and in turn that isn't going to help us when we're trying to perform our clinical studies. Protocol designs. Protocols are actually becoming extremely interesting. Once upon a time, I think the vaccine study protocols were very similar. Now we're seeing lots of different changes taking place. Something I think that's very important coming through is the adaptive designs. And we're seeing this a lot now, where particularly in the first phase of the protocol, there may be 3 or 4 cohorts that are exploring a different dose or perhaps a different dosing regimen, then an interim analysis, and then the next component of the study. And one of the problems that is really coming through with that is particularly around the availability of the vaccine for the second part of the study. Everyone here knows how difficult it is with manufacturing slots, ensuring that you've got your vaccine, and particularly if you've got 3 or 4 cohorts in that first part of the adaptive design, you may not know which vaccine you're actually going to be using for the second part. So it is very, very important to look at the timelines, and if the protocol is anticipating 2 months between the stopping of one part of the study and the starting of the next, well, is your manufacturer really going to keep up with that? In many cases, I suspect the answer is probably no, but that's something really important to think about again, because it comes back to what I was saying earlier. We're standing there with our patients or volunteers waiting to get their vaccine, and there's no vaccine available. The case study that I want to talk through is specifically a study that looked at the human rotavirus vaccine. About 4 years ago, we built a clinic in the township of Maumolodi, which is about 10 miles outside of Pretoria. The clinic provides very basic medical health care for the people who live there. Maumolodi is, as you see the townships on television, there are 4 million people living there. There's no sanitation, no running water. They live in tin shacks. Infant mortality rate is high. Literacy rates are low. And we built our clinic partly on a charitable basis to provide health care for people, but also as a way of being able to look at providing medication for diseases, particularly some of the orphan diseases, but also for looking at the development of vaccines as well, because we know that there's some huge unmet medical needs. This particular study was done in collaboration with a significant group of people. The University of Limpopo and also the Magdeburg Centre of Research were key involved in the study. We had our own centre in Maumolodi, which was the coordinating centre for the clinical study. And we also had 10 other outreach clinics that were involved. So this was a large programme. As you can see from the numbers, we actually undertook 2 phases of the study in 2 separate years. In the first year, we recruited almost 1,200 babies, and in the second, it was just over 900. The infants were between 5 and 10 weeks of age, and as I said, they were enrolled in 2 cohorts that corresponded with the 2 consecutive rotavirus seasons. As you know, rotavirus tends to be seasonal, so this was done 2 consecutive years. We worked very closely with the community care groups, and we also have our own outreach nurses who go into the township and work with the people. They help to provide education, they help to provide advice on sanitation where possible, and they have some very strong relationships with the community groups working there. Because this was a diarrheal disease, the endpoint, which is very complicated in terms of its collection, was actually stool samples. That sounds very easy to us, but the reality is that when you're collecting stool samples from infants in a township where there are no postal addresses, there are no street names, and actually being able to follow up with the families to find out what's happening with the children, that is a huge undertaking in its own right. We spent a great deal of time working with the local community leaders to be able to put a network in place that would allow us to be able to do this. All the stool samples had to be tested at the pathogens research unit at Limpopo. That also meant that they had to be collected. So what we did with them was we arranged when the community nurses or the community carers had the samples collected, they would bring them straight to our clinic. Now, one of the problems we have with this is that the samples have to be viable. So coming into our clinic meant that we could automatically let Limpopo know that there was a sample coming through, and they would process it immediately to let us know if it was viable or not, because if it wasn't, then we needed to get another sample. So again, there was a lot of logistics around arranging that. Sounds easy, but it's not, unless you think about it and plan it well in advance. The vaccine efficacy was assessed from 2 weeks after the last dose of vaccine until the child reached 1 year of age. So we're talking a 1-year follow-up period. So these children were basically being assessed every week for a year. Sometimes some of them would actually come into our clinic to be assessed, but many of them were being assessed in their own homes by the field workers. The assessment of the immunogenicity was done by collecting the blood samples from the infants immediately before their first dose and then 1 month after the last dose. So the challenges that we were looking at here was the collaboration of the multiple stakeholders. So we've got the different clinical groups, the nurses for the outreach, the community care workers, Limpopo University, the client who in this particular case was GSK, the logistics of the courier companies. And when you actually think about organising all of that in a township where electricity, etc., isn't available, that takes a lot of planning. The end point was complex because, as I said earlier, this was active surveillance on a weekly basis. And we're talking 1,000 babies in the first cohort and 900 in the second. So again, that's a big, big undertaking to be done on a weekly basis. The follow-up period, and this is something that I think is really quite remarkable, when we looked at the retention in the study of that 1-year follow-up period, we had 92% of the subjects were still there for their final follow-up at 1 year. Now, the 8% that weren't, some of them were just lost to follow-up. We don't know what happened to them. We do know that some of them moved away, but trying to follow them was impossible to do. Within the 92% that we did have follow-up for, that also included a certain percentage who had died, some of diarrheal disease, but others who died of other causes. Informed consent, this was a huge challenge. In the townships, girls become sexually active at the age of about 11, and usually it's not through their own consent either. Therefore, birth rates in 12 and 13 or 14-year-olds are very high. And this was quite an issue for us with the study because, as you know, under ICH-GCP, anybody under the age of 16 cannot consent either for themselves or for anyone else to be enrolled into a clinical study. So we had to work with the ethics committee and also with the community leaders to be able to get an arrangement in place that would allow for the grandmothers of the babies to act as the next of kin or the legal next of kin to be able to have them enrolled into the study. So that meant that the consent process was much more complicated than you would normally expect it to be. However, it worked. And again, because of the tremendous work that's done by the community outreach group and the community nurses, it actually worked extremely well. And I have to say that I was absolutely delighted with that. Communication, I noticed earlier this morning that one of the other speakers had that lovely picture of the little girl standing there, dressed in her sort of tribal outfit, holding a mobile phone. It's absolutely right. Lots of the technology that we've been using for years has simply passed by, but the mobile phone is king, there's no doubt about it. And it's actually quite a status symbol as well. So we found that by using mobile phones, this was actually one of the best ways of getting communication within the community, and particularly where we had outreach clinics, that we could use that form of communication to keep in touch, to find out what was happening, whether people were coming back for their follow-up appointments, etc. So that worked really, really well. The study logistics, I've talked about that already, when really making sure that those samples were viable was really very, very important to the success of this trial. The results, and I think this really vindicated all the effort that went into it. It was a successful study, as we've seen from the recruitment, but it was also successful in terms of the efficacy results. And as a result of that, the World Health Organization Strategic Advisory Group have recommended that the rotavirus vaccination of infants is included in all the national programs. And I think that is a tremendous advantage. I don't know if anyone here has ever seen a child dying of a diarrheal disease, but it is truly terrible. So I have to say that when I see this, it makes me feel extremely pleased that all that effort was worthwhile. Any questions?
I have one question, if I may. The difference in nurture, diet,
Sure.
environment, that type of thing, do you think it changes the response, the immunological response of a vaccine?
I'm sure it must do. And not only is it, as you say, the nutritional environment, but also when you look at the ages as well, that's clearly going to have an impact in terms of the immunogenicity of the vaccines. So I would say yes. One of the things that we have, obviously, is the fact that these babies were 5 to 10 weeks old. But even in that very short time period of their lives, you do see significant weight reductions, particularly if they're not getting good nutrition. So yes, I do think it's extremely important. But part of the clinic outreach group is actually not only providing the vaccine, but was actually providing baby care as well. So in terms of helping with nutritional supplement.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.